Hi everyone, welcome. We're going to let everyone continue to log on and get settled, and we'll start in just a couple of minutes. For those just logging on, welcome. We are going to give everyone just another minute or two, and then we will get started. Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Devin from Cloverleaf. We're hosting this webinar on creating a culture of learning along with our partner ThinkHuman. Cloverleaf is a team building platform that uses people and performance data to increase team effectiveness through improved communication and better relationships. ThinkHuman works with growth organizations like Spotify, SoulCycle, and Flatiron Health, leading manager training and leadership development to support thriving growth cultures. We have incredible panelists today that our moderator will introduce, and they're going to be answering your questions. Many of you submitted questions in your registration, and you can also find the QA button on the bottom of your screen and submit them there. Now, let me turn this over to Meredith, the ThinkHuman CEO and moderator for today's panel.
All right, welcome everybody. We are so happy to have you here. So over the next 45 minutes, we have this incredible panel of experts that are going to be sharing their experience building growth cultures. And they're going to be taking your questions. So as Devin said, please submit your questions, find that Q&A button, and get involved in the conversation. So as a starting point for context, in this complex and volatile world that we live in, more than ever, we need to be learning and growing, and organizations need to be able to quickly learn and adapt. Businesses take some market position and fight for it, and then quickly become obsolete in this kind of environment. So without elevating the learning of our people in our organizations, we're either on a treadmill for new talent to stay relevant, or we're falling behind. So the lifespan of the average S&P 500 company, which was once 67 years, is now just 15 years. The environment is unforgiving toward organizations that take too long to learn. So as Professor Leon McGenson famously built on Darwin, it's not the strongest that survive, and it's not even the most intelligent. It's those that are most able to adapt to change. So to stay relevant in today's environment just requires a fierce capacity to learn and to improve and to adapt. And growth cultures, you could say, have at least two critical domains, right? On one side, we have business learning, where a learning organization is focusing on process and skill learning to transform and adapt in this ever-changing and dynamic world. And then in that learning or business learning side, startup culture in many ways has built in or embedded some of the principles of a learning organization with things like actively noticing background assumptions and bringing them to the foreground and challenging those assumptions, and testing new approaches through experiments, right? And taking time for deliberate reflection, things like retrospectives. So some things in the learning culture have become kind of natural for us, and that's all on the business learning side, right? And then on the other side of a growth culture is this second part that's about personal growth, to have each individual be at our best. So at the same time that businesses are facing all these complex and uncertain forces coming at us, the human beings and the businesses, we're facing the same thing, and it can drive up fear and compromise capacity. So growth culture, or a deliberately developmental organization, is built to have people also growing as human beings, to have us noticing our personal blind spots and being open enough to look at and take responsibility for our vulnerabilities, rather than just unconsciously acting them out in the workplace, which then creates a second powerful accelerator to thrive in, especially in this volatile world that we live in. So, Devin, we have you back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. We have, in addition to Devin, who introduced us, an incredible panel of experts who have built award-winning organizations, hypergrowth organizations, that are here to share with you today, sharing their experience and taking your questions. So we have Siobhan O'Leary, the SVP of People at Convene, a workplace hospitality company with a long list of accolades. I'm not going to name them all, but just a few. Convene is on Inc. magazine's list of America's fastest growing companies. They're Fortune magazine's number 11 best workplace. So Convene and Siobhan, thank you and welcome. We have Darrin Murriner. Darrin is co-founder of Cloverleaf, a behavioral analytics tech platform that leverages technology to embed behavioral learning in team processes. So welcome and thanks, Darrin. And then we have Lyndsey Hannigan, head of talent for Clio, a legal tech company that was, again, long list of accolades, Canada's number 10 fastest growing company, winner of Canada's Best Managed Companies in 2018, Best Tech Culture. So with this amazing panel, let's get started, and let's start broadly. And Lyndsey, I'm going to turn this first question to you. How do you define a deliberately developmental organization? When you say that, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, it's a lot of words to describe a really simple idea, which is that we are being intentional about learning as a key to our success as a business. And that takes a couple of different shapes and forms in our organization. For example, philosophy plays a really important role, right? Getting super clear on the value that we think learning brings to the organization and how that value is expressed in terms of things that are written and things that are lived in our business. So getting concrete on our core philosophy or our beliefs as an organization as it relates to learning. It also takes the shape and form for us of the practices and the processes that we build around that philosophy of learning that help us live it every day with as little resistance as possible, right? We want to make it easy for people to learn and to grow in a deliberately developmental environment. And the third piece is this idea of being at our developmental edge all the time, right? Pushing each other, pushing our systems, pushing our teams to that point that feels just on the other side of comfortable. in service of, stretching and growing ourselves and our business as we, like you said, stay alive through volatility and complexity.
Right. So to get into that stretch zone and keep people there, Siobhan, I'm going to direct this next question to you. From your point of view, why is a learning culture important? What are some of the indicators specifically in your organization of the value of a growth culture?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. Well, we believe that if we're not learning and growing, then we might as well just close the doors. As an industry doesn't just say, this is our product and that's it, we're never going to evolve. So we just believe we have a value of 1% better every day, and that's one of our core values, and we say it all the time, and it's one of our rituals. So we really see that come to life in our ability to fail forward and really learn from those mistakes and take that 1% better and move our needle forward. We also see that come to life in some of our stats, right? Everyone wants to know what's in it for them to join your organization. And so if we can really meet people where they are and their learning needs, then we believe if they're learning, we're learning too. And we see that in our lack of turnover and our ability to attract talent.
Yeah.
Hey, Meredith, if I could add a little something to that too. I was thinking about this question before we got on, and one of the things that I think is often overlooked on when we think about the importance of a learning culture is the creation of resilience. Organizationally, not just as an individual. I have 3 children, and the idea of watching my children, maybe fall off a small stool or down a couple of steps on a flight. They kind of start to learn, what are some of the things, and if I can teach them on a small scale, when those bigger challenges kind of come along, they're just instantly more resilient and able to identify those risks before they happen. And I think oftentimes that piece of learning culture is often overlooked organizationally, and kind of the impact it has on corporate strategy or business strategy, and how we can adapt when the market shifts or when we get a new competitor. So that's one thing that I think is often overlooked in terms of the value of a learning culture.
Yeah, I hear you. So from a people perspective, the ability to attract the best people, as you said, Siobhan, in recruiting, and create internal movement so they're growing internally, and then retain the best people. And as you're saying, Darrin, from a business strategy point of view, building resilience in providing the ability to adapt and capture opportunity before that opportunity is gone. So we have a question from one of the participants now. It's the golden question. How to do this? How do you actually, in practice, start to embed growth? So Emily is asking, what are the key steps to building a growth culture? What are the key pillars and programs that you've put in place to embed growth through every level of the organization? Lyndsey, do you want to take a first crack at this? Share what you guys are doing at Clio?
Yeah, I think a really fundamental first step for us was repositioning HR as a function. So rather than just being a transactional service provider, or worse, a cost center, I think we aligned ourselves really early on with talent being an accelerator for the business. And that's a really simple shift in terms of the frame around HR traditionally, but it gives us access to a whole bunch of different practices and kind of rituals, to use that word again, that help the organization see learning and growth as critical to business success. It also gave us a little bit more lateral room to play with innovative programs as it relates to learning. Some of the things that we did really early on was define our practices around reimbursing for education or personal learning, right? When people want to attend a conference or buy a book, what's the process for taking that initiative on their own without approval in some cases, and being reimbursed as an individual. We've also brought in goal setting frameworks like OKRs as a tool that's really lightweight for helping people define their learning objectives and key results that will help them stay on track as they progress. And then as we've kind of evolved our learning programming, we've introduced things like custom manager training or leadership development programming, a really robust in-house coaching program, peer coaching and mentorship opportunities, team development work, right? It's almost like you can start to layer on top of that foundational principle of learning once you've got the leeway and once the organization understands that your role is to speed the organization up through the tool of learning.
Mm-hmm. Really good. So Siobhan, anything you want to add on about what Convene is doing, either that's the same or different to embed growth, and what are the key pillars and programs you guys are doing?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that, Lyndsey and I are much aligned on the rituals and the idea of internal coaching. So one of the first things that was a real passion of mine to implement at Convene was an internal coaching program. And I mean internal by coaching the mid-managers and above and piloting that at that level, knowing that our founders really supported that. So that we saw a lot of traction in that, just piloting it. And so it grew, and we reflected back and recognized how many people had gone through that program, and that they talk about it among themselves. And from there, we built out a leadership development program that was steeped in some of the same philosophies. But I wanted to back up. One of the, what Lyndsey said is so true. You have to be really clear about what you're willing to do or not willing to do, or when you define it, how much needs to be defined. And what I mean by that is, how simple are you keeping the parameters? Because you don't want people to have to jump through hoops to learn, right? If you're really going to support it, I would say, keep the parameters simple. So that would be just sort of a zoom out thought. And the other thing is that when managers get onboarded with us, we have 3 books that we give to every manager. One's based on our customer feedback, one's based on our leadership philosophy, and the other's based on our value premise, which is grit. So right out of the gate, I'm sure they're a little overwhelmed and think they have to do a book report, which we hopefully tell them they don't, but right out of the gate, they feel that, we have a culture of learning, and we're constantly trying to, learn from each other and learn from every different medium. So, it's all, I always say training starts the day you call someone for an interview. So you set the tone right away. And you set the tone out of curiosity. And in today's world, we're moving so fast that if we're not curious, and if we don't allow other people to be curious, they can't really help us grow the business. As fast as they're growing, we're growing. So I guess, the books are kind of the tangible piece of how they can visibly see we support their learning. We try to keep it simple. And we have a very robust coaching program that people are really enthralled with.
Yeah, awesome. I hear a few key, themes in what you guys are saying. Number one, that talent is not a service business in your business. It's really driving the business, and the critical nature of curiosity from the start, from the talent that you're looking for and bringing into the organization, and then nurturing that curiosity all the way along. Learning in all dimensions. So whether it's books or supporting things people are doing outside work that you don't even know about, being an advocate and proponent to support that. And then leadership development at all levels, embedding coaching. I mean, I just hear like there seems to be a bit of a playbook that you guys are both following. So sisters from another mother or something. And then lastly, I just want to highlight from my pre-conversations with you guys, I also noticed that it's not just in the L&D coaching books, recruiting, the things that are traditionally owned by people or people ops, but in things like that the managers are running, like OKR reviews and performance reviews and even bonuses, that you're aligning those processes with a growth focus. Anything any of you want to add about that?
Yeah, I can jump in. We have a measurable hours, a learning hours per year that is reflected in everyone's incentive payout as a small percentage of their success. So each person has to participate in 65 hours of learning a year. And we track it quarterly. Their managers track it. They track it for themselves. And they can get it in so many different ways that are simple for them to achieve depending on what level they are in the organization. And we try to use some online tools, which, I'm sure Darrin can speak about much more fluidly than I do. But, we try to just reach the audience. We have a broad audience in our group. So we try to reach many different constituencies in the mediums in which they can learn, but they all have that 65 hours to meet.
Darrin or Lyndsey, anything you guys want to add about aligning business processes with a growth focus?
A couple other things that came to my mind when Siobhan was talking earlier, just about the approachability of some of the aspects. So I think, when you use the word align, one of the things that immediately comes to my mind is how aligned is senior management, the C-level, with what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and kind of the cultural support that is given, whether that's budgetary or it's kind of providing the freedom or flexibility organizationally to allow people to do learning-based or growth-minded approaches. So things like rotational programs or apprenticeships, those are often things that they are very approachable, but it requires a level of commitment at senior levels in the organization to kind of support that. The other thing in terms of alignment that I also think is hiring practices. So we're talking a lot about what we're doing with the people that are already in our organization, but if we're talking about a culture of learning, we've used words like curiosity and, growth mindset today. So what are the questions that you're asking? What are the things that you're doing? What are the profiles, the roles that you've created? And how are you aligning your recruitment and hiring practices and policies to kind of support that as well?
I think that sorry, go ahead, Meredith.
No, please, Lyndsey, jump in.
Okay. I think similar to both what Darrin and what Siobhan are saying, at Clio, we've really focused on democratizing the practice of feedback, both giving and receiving feedback, meaning that it's helped with alignment in the sense that the learning exercise of giving and receiving feedback is no longer hierarchical. It's not just something that happens twice a year when a manager sits down with his or her employee and gives them performance feedback over the previous 6 months. We train people on the tools for receiving and giving feedback within their first month. It's part of their onboarding. And one of the first challenges that is issued to them is to find an opportunity to give somebody in the organization a piece of radically candid feedback before the end of their first week. So it's setting the tone for feedback as an accelerant in the organization very, very early on. And that carries on in the rest of the organization in a democratized sense when we host things like product demo days, where our product development team will gather people from every function across the business and do a 15-minute demo of the thing that they're building, the thing that they're working on, and ask for feedback from people who have absolutely no connection to that product or the team that's developing it. They want to gather as much feedback from customers, from other parts of the business, from people in talent as they possibly can in service of making that thing better. Within the teams, they've also moved away from the practice of postmortems, which implies that something has died, right? And learning from something that has died, to a process of continuous learning review, meaning mid-project, at the end of every agile sprint, at the end of every 2-week push, they're getting together to check in on what's working and what's not. And in that sense, it kind of takes some of the blame and shame of feedback or of failure away and replaces it with a sense of, something to be gained on the other side. So in that sense, it's been really easy to align the rest of the business around this practice or this process that isn't just about top-down learning per se. It's shared collective community learning.
Just to jump in, with what Lyndsey's saying about feedback is it's the whole buzz, and it's completely true. Radical candor and tough conversations and just direct conversations are really the manner in which we all have to communicate the pace that every business is going. So, but what happens then is if we don't support a culture of learning, then you can't support that radical candor. And there are organizations and departments within organizations that don't do both. And you can imagine what that feels like. So if we're going to support the radical candor philosophy and and we want constant feedback for constant iteration, then we've got to give them tools and support, either financially or otherwise, how to have corrective action or progressive action. Yeah. So they go together. And Lyndsey brought up another excellent point about senior leadership commitment. So, you know, I'm sure there are people on the call that have organizations that, you know, may have been established differently. And the question I always get about coaching and a learning culture financially is, well, how do you pay for it? How do you budget these things? And, you know, I always ask the question of if you can either pay for learning or you can pay a multiple of that for recruiting. So, you know, if that's one of the questions that's out there right now, well, how can you afford to do all of this? You know, I would just go back and look at what you're spending on turnover or recruiting, or it doesn't even have to be that clear. It could be on guest feedback issues or client feedback or business process breakdown or things that didn't get off the ground or whatever that roadblock might be in your business or your product. I'm sure at the onset, you know, if we support learning financially, we could mitigate some of that cost.
Yeah, so we have two questions that just come in perfectly on the heels of what you guys are saying. There are two questions about coaching. So thematically, I hear the importance of feedback, not just unidirectional feedback, but bidirectional feedback, which means people need to know how to give it and be emboldened to give feedback, including upward or peer feedback, and need to know how to receive feedback and make it safe for people to give it to them and make it actionable when people do give it to them, which those skills are not just, you know, we're not born with them. We're not learning them in school. We really have to equip people and support that. And a coaching mindset is, I think, an important component in that. So here I'm going to share two of the questions that have come in about coaching. First, a really practical one about your internal coaching programs. Doug is asking, how many people are filling the coaching role and how many people are getting coaching?
You want to take that one first?
Siobhan?
Sure, I can do that. So let me clarify something. So we have, year to date, I have 37 people that have gone through our coaching program with external coaches. So those would be coaches that I have a bank of coaches, a roster of coaches that serve as our vendor partners for that program. Internally, we have 6 people that are certified coaches. They serve as coaches for our management trainees and our very, I would say, new managers, newly promoted managers. And we do that for a number of reasons. Our internal coaches are newly certified, and it gives them an opportunity to practice their skill, and it gives our management trainees who are right out of school that constant feedback, and it helps them transition into the workplace. I don't know if that totally answered your question, but that's sort of how we have our program set up.
Great. Lyndsey, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, ours is a bit different. So we've recruited an external coach to come inside the organization and work with us as our internal performance coach. Her role is much like Siobhan's described, to unlock the potential of our people leaders, but not exclusively people who are in formal people management positions. She works with a roster of 48 people at the moment, which is ridiculous, but she loves it. She keeps telling me she loves it. And she works with them anywhere from a single day, which she calls spot coaching, where they're dealing with one particular targeted issue, through to 6 months of focused leadership coaching. She also works with people who are moving into or out of leadership roles within our organization. So people who are choosing the path of management, or who are opting out of people management to choose a technical leadership role. She works with them, as well as with people who are transitioning in and out of the business after a parental leave. Knowing that change is tough on the individual and on the team. So having some foresight and some planning around how to make that change is part of her portfolio as well. We do have a team of external coaches who work primarily with our executive team, and they're tightly coupled, loosely aligned, I guess, with our internal performance coach. So they share some themes and some kind of strategic direction. And together with my team have built the frame for our coaching training, which we offer to everybody in our leadership development program, leaders and non-leaders alike. And that's really just the fundamental skills of coaching. So across the organization, there's probably 100 plus people who've worked in some way with the coaching methodology, the idea of using GROW, for example, as a method for leading somebody through a coaching conversation. But we have one full-time coach with about 48 people who are being coached by that person.
Yeah, so we got internal coaches on staff working throughout the organization, external coaches working with senior executives, and a coaching model that your managers are getting trained in so that they're using a coaching approach with people throughout every dimension of the organization. So it's really, I can hear kind of 360 degrees coming at people. Darrin, my next question is for you, a question about deliberate practice. And you shared with me about a McKinsey report about how much practice is required to embed new learning. It's kind of staggering. So can you tell us about that and how you at Cloverleaf are creating a faster way for people to get that practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll just tag on to the end of that last question too. So we're a smaller team than I think either Lyndsey or Siobhan has, but it's been growing rapidly in the past few months. And part of what we have done from a technology standpoint is to make sure to enable those conversations. So regardless of whether we call it coaching or not, it's what kind of information can we deliver to people and what kind of intentional questions can we prompt or generate people to ask or consider as they're having those conversations. Similar to kind of a model like GROW, this isn't necessarily a very prescriptive model, but it's more about how people work together. And that's also a really great lead into your question, Meredith. And yes, there was probably within the last year, there was a McKinsey article that talked about, and it's not just a McKinsey article. I mean, this is a common concept from a learning standpoint, and it's how many times you have to practice a particular idea or concept before you actually get to a level of proficiency. And even as many as 5 to 10 times, you're only about 5 to 10% effective with actually making that a part of your core practice. And it takes as many as 30 to 40 opportunities to get to 80% plus proficiency. And so one of our key focuses is on how do we embed those opportunities, specifically in the soft skill space, but also as we think about assessing hard skills as well. How do we make this information and how do we make it accessible, and how do we put it in front of people so that they're getting constant reminders about these ways to tailor or customize their approach to the people that they're working with on a day-to-day basis. Small little things about like, hey, Lyndsey needs positive reinforcement, or she really likes positive reinforcement. You said, job well done this week. So just those little reminders, especially in small teams, like agile teams, where maybe you're working with new people that you haven't worked with on a consistent basis. You need ways to think about how do you customize that approach. And it's also a really great way to kind of support coaching practices or management practices. A lot of times what we see with clients is, people are promoted without a lot of training and support. And so having a tool set that allows them to kind of customize their approach in having those conversations can make those coaching conversations much more effective.
Yeah, so where we have things like leadership development programs that are kind of time boxed that you go through, or coaching, which even if whether it's spot coaching or over an engagement, it's kind of happening outside in some ways outside your normal day-to-day activities. We've got other things that are really embedded in our day-to-day activities, like what you're talking about, Darrin, with how Cloverleaf is serving up those opportunities in our daily interactions. And this next question from Stephanie is asking about mistakes and fail forward, and how to, not just in values or language, but how do we encourage employees to embrace a growth mindset when there's still such a stigma around failure? And more importantly, how do you put that idea of fail forward into practice in the structures and processes in the organization? So any of you want to jump in with an answer to that?
I think one of the things that come to my mind, and we've hit on this a couple of times, are just kind of what are the practices or the rituals that you're doing, and how can you reinforce some of those concepts? So even things, and I think Lyndsey mentioned earlier, retrospectives, or if you're having daily stand-ups, what are questions that you can ask as a part of that ritual that kind of celebrates the fact that you're learning, right? It's not the post-mortem concept of failure, but more so, hey, we've tried some things and, here's the results and we're going to make some adjustments. So just those small little tweaks to our language and being a little bit more intentional about some of the questions that we ask, at least for our team, we found that to be extremely effective in terms of embedding that kind of learning culture in our day-to-day approach.
Yeah, I love that idea. And as you were talking, Darrin, I was thinking about the idea of micro practices, or boiling down that thing you want to get better at into little, tiny, totally achievable chunks, and then reflecting on it, right? Building the reflective capacity or the reflective muscle individually and together to say, I thought I was going to do this, I did this, and it had this impact. And now I'm going to take the knowledge or the learning that's come from that impact and put it into the next plan, do, review cycle. So I think that there's rituals that can be built around that. Things like we do a learning showcase at the end of our manager training kind of arc. After the curriculum is complete, we have all of the participants stand up and say, this was the thing I wanted to get better at. This is what I tried. This is the impact, good, bad, and ugly, that thing had. And here's what I'm going to do with it next. And I need your help. I need you to keep me accountable to that practice. And I think it's through that micro practice. It's not, sweeping sea change that we're trying to create, but it's the little micro behavioral shifts that really start to see things moving in an organization. Not at Clio, but at a different organization I was affiliated with in the past. They actually took it so far as to produce 2 annual general reports. One that was for the board. It was their AGR, and it listed all of the typical business metrics that would tell the board how they were performing as a business. But then they had this companion report that they called the annual failure report, where leaders from every part of the organization would submit their team's or their personal greatest failure from the year. And they would write the story of what had happened and what they learned from it and why it mattered that they share that learning more broadly within the company, within the organization, but also to their kind of shareholder or community. And I just thought that was an incredibly courageous thing for an organization to do, and something that for me has kind of set the standard for what a real fail forward kind of organization looks like. If you're willing to put a stake in the ground and say, yeah, that really hurt when we face planted with that new idea or that risky endeavor that we took on. When we face planted, it hurt, it bruised, and we learned a lesson so that nobody else has to go through that same pain.
Yes, an ink on paper. I'm not afraid to say it. Here's what it is. So in the spirit of that, most of us at work, human beings, even in high-performing organizations, divert a considerable amount of attention and energy and internal resources to a second day job that we were never hired to do, protecting our egos, right? Taking care of our reputations. And instinctively, we're each inclined to hide our vulnerabilities because they make us feel at risk. So that's natural that self-preserving behavior exists, but it's also erosive and undermining and a huge cause of wasted resources in nearly every company. So Siobhan, let's have you answer this next question from Allison. Allison is asking, what's worked in your organization that others can apply to help to elevate both self-awareness and to bring an openness and personal responsibility about our weaknesses or vulnerabilities or areas that we're working on versus a self-preserving attitude?
Wow, what a question. Okay, so the key there is self-awareness. And we, in our leadership program, we have 12 traits of successful leaders, and we focus on the number one trait being acute awareness of self and others. And so I think that just sort of answers it. And if we have something that Darrin mentioned is questions and behaviors, and in our practice is open-ended questions, right? So one of the things that we do for self-awareness is when we disagree in a meeting, we have a ritual and a practice of you have to ask a question before you make a comment. So you have to ask an open-ended question before you disagree. Perhaps then you won't disagree, or then you'll ask another question. But you can see what that allows us to do. So I don't know if that helps or answers the question, but we have a huge commitment to self-awareness and awareness of others, and it allows us to understand that it's just as important to play to our strengths, but understand our weaknesses and other people's strengths may compensate and complement that. So that feature kind of becomes a ritual. If you're asking an open-ended question, you're calming yourself down and listening to that. So I don't know if that helps, but that's one of our little tools.
It does. And as we're rounding out to 11:45 Pacific, 2:45 Eastern, we've got just a couple minutes left until that. So one final question and then some closing thoughts. So from each of you, 1 minute of advice. If people are going to do just one single thing coming out of this webinar, just one, what is the one high leverage thing you'd have them do? And Darrin, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think I would just continue the theme of, as Lyndsey put it, micro kind of practices, and what are these things that you can kind of embed in your rituals, even if it's just a simple list of questions that are more specific and directive in terms of making your conversations more intentional towards what are you learning and how are you growing, either as an individual or within the team in a stand-up or a retrospective or in one-on-one conversations. Being a little bit more intentional with those questions and being more specific can go a long way towards driving kind of a culture of learning and an expectation that trying things in small ways, and even if it ends in failure, is important not just for individual growth and development, but also for the resiliency of the team and the organization as a whole.
Great. So the risk of experimentation and micro practices around what are you learning? Lyndsey, how about for you?
Yeah, for me, I think it goes to the last question you asked before this one around self-preservation instinct in organizations and this very primal reaction that we have to the idea of receiving feedback. So I think my practical one piece of advice would be to work with the organization to reframe feedback as something that's a friend, not a foe. And if you don't have the time or the resources to facilitate training on clean versus dirty feedback, or, tools and techniques for giving and receiving feedback, just start by asking for it yourself, right? Ask somebody for feedback, and then tell them how it's going to help you or the business be better. And that's contagious.
Fabulous. So building a feedback culture in Lego blocks, even if you have low budget and low resources. And Siobhan, how about for you? The one thing you would tell people to do?
I would say listen for common language that you can expand on and use to be a catalyst for the learning. Like, take something you already do well in your culture or in your company as a common language to be the catalyst for your learning, whatever that is, whether it's through questions, whether it's through values, whether it's whatever, coaching, but just look for something common that you already have that you can grow with.
Awesome. So common language to keep it simple and weave through everything. So in closing, just a few closing thoughts as we wrap up. With the pace of change in business and really in the world at large, we have to be learning. We need people who have a natural hunger to learn. And then we need a culture that nourishes that, enabling both that business learning, that opportunity to question assumptions and experiment and stretch ourselves out to our stretch zone, and that personal learning where we're equipping people to have more awareness of ourselves and looking at our defenses so we spend less time defending our personal value and have more energy and time available to create external value. So a few key themes that I heard about how we can successfully build a growth culture that provides the safety to be vulnerable and the challenge and support and accountability to grow. I heard common language, that common language to support deliberate development and self-reflection that's woven through everything. Leadership development at all levels, not just for high potentials, but leadership development in addition to hard skill learning. So human beings are growing, and it's a priority at every level of the organization to be at work on being the best version of ourselves. And then I was surprised to hear also this thematic emphasis on coaching and making coaching available, again, deep into the organization, not just for the executives and not even just for the managers, but having it embedded in the whole culture and training managers to lead as coaches. And then lastly, the modeling of personal growth and having leaders in front of their teams be vulnerable to show when things are not working, like with that glossy annual report, here's what's not working, and not just who's to blame or how can I cover it, but here's what we're going to learn, or here's what I can learn from it, and here's how I can grow from it. So we're going to be sending out a couple of follow-ups from today's conversation. Number one, we're sending some of the top tips that came from these awesome panelists. And two, next week we'll be sending out a recording. Thank you to our amazing panelists for being here and sharing your experience and your wisdom. To this community that's listening and submitting your questions and participating, thank you for spending this time with us. We're excited to hear your thoughts too. If you want to share them with us, please email Meredith at think-human.com or Devin at cloverleaf.me. And in wrap up, to build on Professor Leon McGinson's idea about survival, it is not the strongest that survive or even the most intelligent. It's those that are most able to adapt to change. And a growth culture is what enables that. So you guys are amazing, and go make your version of this real in the world. And thank you.